Dear listeners, I welcome you to my channel. If you like my work, please subscribe to the channel, like this video and write a comment. This helps the video to promote and motivates you to try harder every day. If you want to support the channel financially, the link is in the description and in the profile header. Thank you. Enjoy listening. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, an unbroken expanse of cold, dark water. The ferry rocked violently as it neared the island, the waves slapping against its rusted hull. I gripped the rail, my knuckles white, as the silhouette of the lighthouse loomed closer, its beacon slicing through the fog like a spectral eye. I had taken this job out of desperation. Life on the mainland had grown unbearable, and when I saw the ad, lighthouse keeper needed, remote location, I pay, it felt like a lifeline. The details were sparse, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. The idea of solitude, of complete separation from the chaos of the world, seemed almost appealing. The ferry captain, an older man with weathered skin and a permanent scowl, gave me a hard look as he cut the engine. "You sure about this, kid?" His voice was rough, like gravel being ground beneath a boot. "Ain't many last long out here." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll be fine." He muttered something under his breath, then motioned for me to disembark. I grabbed my duffel bag and stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking ominously beneath my weight. The air was thick with the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. A man waited for me at the end of the dock. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale against the black coat he wore. "You are the new keeper?" "Yes," I replied. "My name's Daniel." He didn't offer his own name. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and began walking toward the lighthouse. "Follow me." I hesitated but obeyed, my boots crunching against the damp gravel path. The lighthouse loomed ahead, taller than I had imagined, its white paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The windows were dark, like empty sockets staring into the void. Inside, the air was musty, the scent of oil and damp stone lingering in every corner. The man led me up a narrow staircase to a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed, a desk, and a rusted stove were the only comforts provided. A heavy logbook sat on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. "This will be your quarters," the man said. "You'll find everything you need." I set my bag down, glancing around. What exactly does the job entail? Keep the light on. Every night, without fail. His expression was unreadable. And follow the rules. He handed me a small, weathered notebook. The cover was cracked leather, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through it. Rules for the lighthouse keeper. The light must never go out. Do not open the door after midnight. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. Never acknowledge the figure in the fog. The logbook must be updated every morning. Do not descend into the lower levels. I looked up, confused. "What is this?" The man's expression darkened. "It's for your safety." I let out a nervous chuckle. This is some kind of joke, right? His silence was answer enough. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me alone with the weight of the rules pressing against my chest. That night, as the wind howled outside and the waves battered the rocks below, I sat beside the logbook, staring at the flickering glow of the lamp. The lighthouse creaked and groaned, the sounds of shifting wood and settling stone filling the empty space around me. Then, just past midnight, came the first knock from inside the walls. The knock was soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind and the crashing waves. I told myself it was just the old structure settling, the wood expanding and contracting in the damp night air. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the inside of the wall. I held my breath, staring at the worn wooden planks. The lantern on my desk flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally along the walls. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, my mind racing through the list of rules I had read just hours ago. Rule number 3, if you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. A chill crawled up my spine, but I forced myself to stay still. I had no intention of breaking the rules my first night here, but sleep would not come easily after that. Every creak and groan of the lighthouse felt amplified, every whisper of wind outside a possible warning. By the time the first light of dawn bled into the sky, my body was exhausted, but my mind was sharper than ever. I dragged myself to the logbook, my fingers stiff as I flipped open its thick, yellow pages. The previous entries were meticulous, detailing wind speeds, wave patterns, and minor maintenance reports. Nothing unusual. Nothing that hinted at whatever had knocked in the night. I wrote my first entry, keeping it simple. January 12th, 5:42 a.m. First night on duty. The light remained on. Heard knocking from inside the walls. Did not investigate. As I set the pen down, something caught my eye, a smudge of ink on the very last page of the logbook, one that hadn't been there before. I turned to it, my breath catching in my throat. The ink was fresh, the words hastily scrawled. Do not trust the fog. I slammed the book shut, my pulse pounding. Who had written that? The last keeper? But why would they write it here, on a page they never intended to submit? A warning for the next person? For me? Shoving the uneasy thought aside, I decided to explore the lighthouse in daylight. The interior was old but sturdy, the stairwell winding up toward the beacon. Rusting oil cans and broken tools were scattered in the supply closet near the entrance, along with spare bulbs and a thick maintenance manual. But the lower levels, where rule number 6 warned me never to go, were locked with an iron chain that looked far newer than the rest of the building. As the day dragged on, I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows moved oddly along the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't align with the sunlight outside. More than once, I turned, convinced I would find someone standing just out of sight, but the rooms remained empty. By nightfall, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the island whole. The ocean, the dock, even the small generator shed near the lighthouse's base, all of it vanished behind a dense, swirling gray. The beacon's light pulsed steadily above, a lonely eye cutting through the void. I stepped outside briefly, the cold mist curling around me, clinging to my skin like fingers. A noise drifted from the fog, something distant, yet eerily close. It wasn't the wind, nor the waves. It sounded almost human. A voice. Low, whispering, unintelligible at first. Then, clearer. Help me. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the damp stone. The voice had come from somewhere deep in the fog, just beyond my sight. My mind screamed at me to run, to get inside, to lock the door. Rule number 4, never acknowledge the figure in the fog. I turned, forcing myself to keep my eyes on the lighthouse, on the warmth of the doorway. I stepped inside, bolting the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fog pressed against the windows, swirling unnaturally, almost watching. And then, from somewhere within the lighthouse, came the knocking again. This time, it was louder. The knocking continued, relentless and deliberate. Each strike against the wall sent a shiver through my bones, reverberating in the empty lighthouse. I pressed my hands over my ears, willing it to stop, but the sound burrowed into my skull like a parasite. Then, suddenly, silence. I exhaled shakily, my body stiff from tension. The fog outside pressed against the windows, a dense wall of shifting gray that seemed almost alive. I knew better than to look too long. The rules were clear. I forced myself to move, to focus on something tangible. The logbook sat open on my desk, the ink of my previous entry barely dry. My fingers trembled as I wrote. January 13th, 6:04 a.m. The knocking returned, louder this time. Something called from the fog. I did not answer. I hesitated before adding, "The rules are real." My stomach twisted at the admission. When I first arrived, I had assumed the rules were nothing more than remnants of superstition left behind by lonely, paranoid keepers. Now, I wasn't so sure. I spent the morning searching for any sign of intrusion. Every door was still locked, every window latched. And yet, an unsettling awareness lingered, like someone had been standing just behind me all night, watching. It wasn't until I descended to the supply room that I noticed something out of place. A book. It lay on the floor, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, brushing away a layer of dust. The cover was worn, but the title was still visible. Log of Keeper Samuel Wright. The name prickled at my memory. I had skimmed the list of previous keepers before arriving, and Wright had been among them. But I had been told he left the post years ago. I sat on the cold stone floor, flipping through the brittle pages. His handwriting was tight and hurried, growing messier as the entries progressed. The early logs were standard, weather patterns, maintenance notes, routine observations. Then, the tone shifted. The knocking started again last night. Louder this time. Closer. January 5th. The fog is worse than usual. I swear I saw something moving in it. Not a boat. Not a bird. January 7th. I heard the voice. It knew my name. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, skimming feverishly. January 9th. I broke the rule. I answered it. The next page was torn out. The entry after that was barely legible, the ink smudged and erratic. It's inside now. I snapped the book shut, my pulse roaring in my ears. A wave of nausea crashed over me. Samuel Wright had been here before me. He had followed the rules until he hadn't. And then he disappeared. A sudden gust of wind howled through the lighthouse, rattling the windows. The fog outside thickened, swirling against the glass in unnatural patterns. I had to get out of that room. I stuffed the log into my pocket and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the lantern room, throwing open the hatch to the outside balcony. The salt air burned my lungs, but I welcomed it. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the fog, a vast abyss of shifting black and gray. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe up here. Then, movement. Something in the fog. A shape, indistinct, yet unmistakably human, standing just beyond the reach of the lighthouse's beam. My blood ran cold. It didn't move, didn't waver, just stood there, waiting. A memory surged through me, Samuel's log. I heard the voice. It knew my name. The wind carried a whisper to my ears, threading through the howling gale. Daniel. My name. I stumbled back, my spine pressing against the cold metal railing. The thing in the fog remained motionless. I clenched my eyes shut, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles ached. Do not acknowledge the figure in the fog. I forced myself to turn away, stepping back into the lantern room and locking the hatch. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed against the wall, sinking to the floor. I didn't look outside again that night. Instead, I lay awake, Samuel Wright's log clutched in my hands, dreading the inevitable. The knock came again, this time from inside my room. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate, just inches from where I lay. I held my breath, gripping the logbook in my hands like a lifeline. The air in the room had grown thick, heavy with something unseen, something waiting. My mind screamed for me to stay still, to pretend I hadn't heard, but my body betrayed me. I turned my head. The door to my quarters remained shut, the rusted lock intact. But the knocking had not come from the door. It had come from inside the room. A shiver crawled down my spine as I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The lantern on my desk flickered as if disturbed by an unseen breath. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, but nothing moved. Yet I wasn't alone. I could feel it, pressing against my skin like a phantom touch. I squeezed my eyes shut, the words of the rules echoing in my head. Rule number 3, if you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. But how could I not? It wasn't just the walls anymore. It was here. With me. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lantern, its weak glow barely pushing back the shadows. Then, the whisper came, low and ragged, slipping through the air like a draft through a broken window. Daniel. My name. It knew my name. I bolted upright, my chair scraping against the floor. The whisper had come from the far corner of the room, where a heavy wooden wardrobe stood, its doors slightly ajar. The space beyond was black and possibly deep, as though it led somewhere far beyond the confines of the lighthouse. I had two choices: follow the rules or find out what was lurking in the darkness. Some primal part of me screamed to run, to flee this cursed island and never look back. But the other part, the foolish, desperate part, demanded answers. My feet moved before my mind could stop them. Step by step, I approached the wardrobe, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp wood and salt. My fingers brushed the door's edge. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from within the wardrobe, something exhaled. I yanked the door open. Darkness. Deeper than the night sky, deeper than the ocean below. A void, endless and yawning. And in that void, eyes. A dozen of them, blinking in unison, their pale irises reflecting the lantern light. My breath hitched, a primal terror rooting me to the spot. The thing inside shifted, and the air around me turned frigid, sharp like needles against my skin. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. The light sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. A sound, low and guttural, rose from the wardrobe, a noise like laughter distorted through a broken radio. Then the whisper returned, closer this time. You broke the rule. I scrambled for the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. My fingers were numb, shaking too hard to grasp the handle. The wardrobe groaned as something inside began to move, its form slithering forward, unseen but unmistakably there. With a final, desperate twist, the lock gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with fog, seeping into the lighthouse like an invading tide. The walls pulsed, the entire structure groaning as if alive. I ran. Up the winding stairs, past the empty supply room, past the heavy iron chain sealing off the lower levels. The lighthouse trembled around me, the fog whispering secrets I dared not understand. My mind screamed for escape, but I knew there was nowhere to go. At last, I reached the lantern room. The great beacon spun in slow, methodical circles, its light piercing the dense fog. I pressed myself against the glass, my chest heaving. Below, the island was gone, swallowed by the mist. And then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the fog. Their forms were indistinct, shifting with the mist, but I could feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. One figure stepped forward. Taller than the rest, its face obscured by the swirling gray. But I knew who it was before it even spoke. Samuel Wright. The last keeper. The one who had broken the rules before me. His voice reached me, distant yet deafening. You let it in. I pressed my hands against the glass, my body trembling. What is it? What's in the lighthouse? Samuel didn't answer. He only lifted his hand, pointing toward the stairwell behind me. The meaning was clear. It wasn't outside that I had to fear. It was inside. A soft creak sounded from below. A footstep on the stairs. I turned slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. Something was coming up the stairs. And it knew my name. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each creak of the stairs echoed through the lighthouse, an invasive sound that burrowed deep into my skull. I pressed myself against the lantern room's glass, my breath fogging up the surface as I stared down at the swirling mist below. The figures remained at the edge of the fog, their blurred forms unmoving, watching. Waiting. I turned back toward the stairwell. The air had grown thick, heavy with something unseen but palpable. My pulse thundered in my ears. I should have listened to the rules. I should never have opened that wardrobe. But it was too late now. The footsteps stopped just beyond my line of sight. The air seemed to hum, vibrating like the strings of an unseen instrument. Then, Daniel. The voice was wrong. It had my mother's tone, her soft lilt, but it was hollow, stretched thin like it had been passed through a broken radio. My stomach twisted. My mother was thousands of miles away. I gripped the lantern room's railing, my knuckles white. "You're not real." Silence. Then another step. The rules. Never acknowledge the voices. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the rhythmic sweep of the beacon's light. If I followed the rules, maybe it would go away. Maybe. The whisper came from directly behind me. "Daniel, please." I spun, expecting to see the empty stairwell. Instead, I saw movement, something shifting in the dim glow of the lighthouse's rotating beam. A shape. Too tall, too thin, its form flickering like a badly spliced film reel. It took a step closer. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for anything to use as a weapon. My fingers closed around the logbook I had stolen from the supply room, the one belonging to Samuel Wright. I flipped it open, desperate for anything that could help me. The pages were worn, some stained with what I prayed was just ink. My eyes darted over frantic, looping scrolls. January 10th. It knows my name. January 11th. The fog is inside now. January 12th. I see them in my dreams. They whisper the rules backwards. January 13th. There is no way out. My throat tightened. Samuel had been trapped, just as I was now. And then, I turned the page, and there, written in bold, desperate strokes, was a final message. The basement. I barely had time to process the meaning before the thing in the stairwell moved. A jerk, an unnatural twist of limbs, and then it lunged. I ran. Down the stairs, two at a time. The air shifted around me, thick with unseen hands reaching, grasping. I slammed into the walls, my balance barely holding as I spiraled downward. The knocking returned, rapid and frantic, pounding from inside the walls as though something was desperate to get out. I reached the locked door at the bottom of the lighthouse, the one chained shut, the one the rules forbade me from opening. Behind me, the footsteps returned, faster now. More of them. I yanked at the chain. Rust flaked against my fingers. The lock was old, corroded with time, but it held firm. I searched frantically for a key, for anything to pry it open. A whisper slid against my ear, impossibly close. "You don't belong here." I turned, my back against the door. The figures had followed me down, their shapes flickering in and out of focus, surrounding me. Their mouths moved, but no words came out, only the sound of the sea crashing against invisible shores. Then, as if guided by something unseen, my hand drifted to my pocket. The lighthouse keeper's key, the one I had never used. My fingers closed around it. I shoved it into the lock. The chain dropped away. The basement door creaked open, revealing a darkness deeper than anything I had ever known. And then something pulled me inside. I had never been particularly picky about jobs. Bills needed to be paid, and my options were limited. That's how I ended up working in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a massive, cold structure that looked abandoned even in broad daylight. When I saw the job listing, promising good pay for night shifts with minimal interaction, I thought it was perfect. I didn't mind being alone. I didn't mind the dark. I should have. The hiring process was surprisingly easy. Too easy. I applied online, received an invitation within an hour, and by the next evening, I was standing in front of the warehouse, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The man who greeted me was short and thin, his face pale and drawn as if he hadn't slept in weeks. His name tag read Ronald. "Welcome," he said in a monotone voice. "You're the new guy." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yeah, just started." Ronald sighed and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to me without looking at my face. Read this. Memorize it. Follow it exactly. I unfolded the paper, the dim yellow light from the entrance barely illuminating the typewritten words. Rules for the night shift. Always clock in by 9 p.m. sharp. Do not be late. Do not be early. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. The lights in the eastern section may flicker. Do not attempt to fix them. Do not look at them for too long. If the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30 before checking if it's shut. If you see someone who looks like you inside the warehouse, do not acknowledge them. Leave immediately and call Ronald. At exactly 3:15 a.m., take a 15-minute break in the break room. No matter what. Never enter the storage unit labeled 12-07. It doesn't exist. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. It will stop eventually. Leave by 6 a.m. No exceptions. I stared at the paper, feeling my heartbeat quicken. Is this a joke? Ronald didn't smile. You start now. The warehouse was even colder inside than it was outside. The air smelled of dust and old cardboard, the scent of forgotten things left too long in one place. The rows of towering shelves stretched into the darkness, their contents barely visible in the flickering overhead lights. Ronald led me to the time clock, where I punched in. Just follow the rules, he muttered, before turning and walking away. No good luck, no let me show you around. Just that ominous warning. For the first hour, nothing happened. I moved boxes, checked inventory, and tried to ignore the unsettling silence. The place was huge, much bigger than it seemed from the outside. I followed the numbered aisles, occasionally glancing at the list of rules taped inside my pocket. It was ridiculous. It had to be some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, calling my name. Mark. I froze, my hands tightening around the clipboard I was holding. The voice came from aisle 7, deep in the storage section. My first instinct was to investigate, but then I remembered rule number 2. Ignore it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move on. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the concrete floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. The voice didn't call out again. By midnight, I had almost convinced myself it was my imagination. The warehouse had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The way the shadows shifted under the weak fluorescent lights, the constant hum of the ventilation system, it could make anyone feel uneasy. Then the lights in the eastern section started to flicker. I had read rule number 3. Don't fix them. Don't look at them too long. But as I turned a corner, my gaze landed directly on them. The flickering bulbs cast strange, shifting shadows on the concrete floor. It was almost hypnotic. The longer I stared, the more the shadows seemed to move, like they had a life of their own. Shapes twisted and stretched, forming patterns that made no sense. Something moved in the periphery of my vision. I blinked and tore my gaze away, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows returned to normal. I took a shuddering breath and walked away as fast as I could without running. At 3:14 a.m., I remembered rule number 6. I had been so caught up in the eerie atmosphere that I had lost track of time. I hurried to the break room, throwing myself into one of the plastic chairs just as my watch ticked over to 3:15. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was from exertion, from working too hard. But deep down, I knew better. I counted down the minutes, refusing to look at the clock. Outside, in the vast emptiness of the warehouse, something shuffled along the aisles. Something heavy. Something slow. At 3:30 a.m., I forced myself to stand and return to work. By the time 6 a.m. rolled around, I had never been so eager to leave a place in my life. I punched out, stepping into the dawn's weak light with an overwhelming sense of relief. Ronald was waiting by the door, watching me with tired, sunken eyes. You followed the rules, he said simply. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want answers. I would be back the next night, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to be. The second night was worse. After the first shift, I told myself I was overreacting. The warehouse was just an eerie place at night, full of creaks and groans that could easily be mistaken for something sinister. The list of rules? Some kind of weird tradition meant to scare new employees. That was all. At least, that's what I kept repeating as I walked through the front doors at 8:55 p.m. Raul was there again, sitting behind the front desk. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, then quickly returned to his clipboard. "Clock in," he muttered without preamble. I did as he said, the machine beeping softly as it registered my start time. 9 p.m. sharp. Raul pushed a key across the counter toward me. "Stick to your routes. Don't get distracted." Something in his voice made me pause. Distracted by what? He let out a dry chuckle but didn't answer. Instead, he stood, stretched his arms, and headed toward the back door leading to the employee exit. "See you in the morning," he called over his shoulder. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the cavernous warehouse. The first hour was uneventful. I moved boxes from the receiving area to the designated storage aisles, checking numbers against my clipboard and doing my best to ignore the nagging feeling of being watched. Everything was fine until 10:30 p.m. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own movements bouncing off the concrete walls, but then they continued even when I stopped. Soft, deliberate steps coming from aisle 12. I froze. My first instinct was to call out, but rule number 2 echoed in my mind. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. It didn't mention footsteps, though. I took a hesitant step forward, craning my neck to see around the corner of the towering shelves. The dim overhead lights cast long, eerie shadows between the rows of boxes, but there was nothing there. I waited, holding my breath. Silence. Maybe it had been my imagination after all. Shaking off my nerves, I turned back to my work, convincing myself that I was just tired. And then, at exactly 11:15 p.m., the lights in the eastern section started flickering again. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away before the hypnotic flicker could take hold of me like last time. Don't fix them. Don't look too long. But as I turned my back on the faulty bulbs, I saw something else, movement in the farthest corner of the warehouse, near the restricted unit labeled 12-07. My stomach turned. That unit wasn't supposed to exist. I had memorized the layout of the warehouse the night before, tracing my routes in my head so I wouldn't get lost. There was no 12-07. But there it was, a metal storage door, slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. I took an involuntary step back. Then, from inside the unit, something knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. I turned and walked away as fast as I could without running. By the time my break came at 3:15 a.m., my nerves were frayed. I locked myself in the break room, trying to steady my breathing. The vending machine hummed softly in the corner, the only source of sound in the suffocating silence. My hands shook as I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Just the time, 3:17 a.m. now. Something outside shifted. A low scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. Stay inside. No matter what. The scraping noise stopped. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps, just like before, but this time, they were on the break room door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. At exactly 3:30 a.m., my alarm vibrated in my pocket. The knocking stopped. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Nothing else happened, but the feeling of unease never left me. By the time 6 a.m. arrived, I was exhausted. Raul was waiting for me at the exit. He didn't say anything, just watched as I punched out. I hesitated, then finally asked, "Did anyone else hear anything last night?" He looked at me, his face unreadable. "You followed the rules," he said after a long pause. "That's what matters." Then he turned and walked away. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd be coming back for my next shift. By the third night, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the warehouse itself or the rules I had been given. The list burned in my mind, each line a warning I could no longer ignore. I arrived at 8:58 p.m. The air was colder than the previous nights, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and refused to leave. Ronald was waiting for me at the front desk again, his fingers tapping against the clipboard in an anxious rhythm. "You're back," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a greeting, it was an observation. I nodded. "Yeah." Ronald studied me for a moment before sighing and handing over the key. "You followed the rules last night," he said. "That's good. Keep doing that." "What happens if I don't?" I asked before I could stop myself. Ronald's fingers tensed around the clipboard. "Don't." Then, like every night before, he left me alone in the warehouse. The first half of my shift passed uneventfully. I worked quickly, moving boxes, checking inventory, doing my best to pretend I wasn't waiting for something to happen. But something always happened. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the footsteps started again. Soft. Measured. Moving along aisle 12, stopping when I stopped. I knew better than to look. I knew better than to acknowledge it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. That whatever was out there was getting bolder. Then, at 12:07 a.m., I heard the knock. It came from storage unit 12-07, the one that didn't exist. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I clenched my jaw and turned away. Do not acknowledge it. Do not investigate. Then my radio crackled. A voice whispered, "Mark." My breath hitched. I hadn't used the radio all night. The only other person with a radio was Ronald, and he had never spoken to me over it before. Another knock, louder this time. Then another. And another. The air in the warehouse seemed to grow heavier, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. My head throbbed. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Mark," the radio repeated, the voice distorted, too low, too wrong. "Come closer." I turned off the radio. Then the lights in the eastern section started to flicker. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room, my heart hammering in my chest. The rules had been clear, no matter what, take your break at 3:15 a.m. Something moved outside the door. A dragging sound. A whisper. I forced myself to stay put, gripping the edges of the table as the shadows under the door stretched unnaturally long. A low voice, almost amused, murmured, "Why do you hide?" I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. No matter what. At 3:30 a.m., my alarm vibrated against my wrist. The whispering stopped. The shadows receded. The air in the room felt lighter. I stood on shaking legs, pressing my ear against the door. Silence. When I stepped back onto the warehouse floor, nothing had changed. But I knew something had been there. And it had been waiting. At 5:45 a.m., I started counting down the minutes until I could leave. Then the back door opened on its own. A sharp, metallic creak echoed through the warehouse, sending a cold spike of fear through my spine. Rule number 4, if the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30. I squeezed my eyes shut. 1, 2, 3. Something stepped inside. 4, 5, 6. The air turned freezing, the kind of cold that burned. 7, 8, 9. A presence loomed behind me, heavy and wrong. 10, 11, 12. The temperature dropped lower. My breath came out in ragged gasps. 13, 14, 15. The floor creaked. 16, 17, 18. It was right behind me. 19, 20, 21. My muscles locked in place. I couldn't move. 22, 23, 24. A whisper brushed against my ear. 25, 26, 27. My skin crawled. My stomach twisted. 28, 29, 30. I opened my eyes. The door was shut. The presence was gone. But my radio crackled again. "See you soon," it whispered. When I punched out at 6 a.m., Ronald was waiting by the door. He didn't say anything as I walked past him, but as I reached the exit, he muttered, "You lasted longer than most." I turned to face him. What happens to the ones who don't? Ronald didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't sure if I'd be back for another shift, but something told me I might not have a choice. The moment I stepped into the warehouse for my 4th shift, I felt it. Something had changed. The air was heavier, thick with an unspoken tension that wrapped around my throat like invisible fingers. The rules still rattled in my mind, but now they felt less like guidelines and more like desperate warnings. Ronald's usual nod of acknowledgement was absent. He barely glanced at me as I clocked in. His fingers tapped anxiously against his clipboard, a subtle but persistent rhythm that made my skin crawl. "You should have quit," he muttered under his breath. I hesitated, gripping the key he had slid across the counter. "Why?" Ronald exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Because they've noticed you." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned on his heel and disappeared through the back door. By 10 p.m., I was already on edge. The warehouse felt different tonight, not just eerie but hostile, as if it resented my presence. The fluorescent lights above flickered more than usual, casting erratic shadows that made the stacks of boxes seem like lurking figures. At 10:42 p.m., I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow, darker than the others, standing just beyond the reach of the light at the end of aisle 7. I turned my head sharply, but it was gone. My heartbeat stuttered. I was starting to understand what Ronald meant. At 11:30 p.m., I heard the whispering. It started as a low murmur, just at the edge of hearing, impossible to make out. A trick of my mind, I told myself. An auditory hallucination from exhaustion. But then it grew louder, and it was saying my name. I gritted my teeth, focusing on my clipboard. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. The whispering stopped. Then, from somewhere above me, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice, a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was crawling along the rafters. I didn't look up. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room, shaking. The rules said I had to stay here for 15 minutes. I had never been more grateful for a rule in my life. The vending machine hummed. The old fridge rattled. The air was stale but safe. Then the lights flickered. I sucked in a breath. The flickering lights had always been in the eastern section. Never here. Not in the break room. I glanced at the clock. 3:22 a.m. Just a few more minutes. A soft knock came from the other side of the door. 3 sharp raps. Deliberate. Expectant. I swallowed. 15 minutes. No matter what. The knocking came again. Then a voice followed. "Mark, you forgot to check aisle 12. The voice was mine. I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. No matter what. At 3:30 a.m., my alarm buzzed. The knocking stopped. The voice was gone. I opened the door. The warehouse was silent. By 5:50 a.m., I was preparing to leave when I noticed something strange. The cameras, the ones mounted high in each corner, had all turned toward me. I had never seen them move before. I took a slow step back. The cameras followed. My radio crackled to life. I didn't touch it. Static. Then a voice. Low. Amused. You see us now. I ran. At 6 a.m., I slammed my time card into the machine. My hands were shaking. Ronald was waiting at the door. He didn't look surprised. They never do that, I said, my voice hoarse. The cameras. Ronald's expression was grim. You should have quit. I stared at him, my breath unsteady. Where are they? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not my place to say. The door buzzed as it unlocked. I stepped outside into the early morning light, my mind spinning with the implications of what I had just experienced. I wasn't sure if I could come back for another shift, but I had the sinking feeling that it wasn't up to me anymore. I didn't want to come back. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to quit, to disappear and never step foot inside that warehouse again. But I also knew, deep in my gut, that it wouldn't matter. I had seen too much. And now, they had seen me. Still, at 8:55 p.m., I was back in the building, staring at the flickering fluorescent lights and trying to convince myself that it was just another night. Just another shift. Ronald was there, of course. This time, he wasn't tapping his clipboard. He was gripping it, his knuckles white. They're going to test you tonight, he said quietly. I felt my stomach drop. Test me how? His jaw tightened. Just follow the rules. Even the ones that don't make sense. By 10 p.m., the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The cameras, the ones that had moved on their own last night, were all pointed at me again. No matter where I went, no matter which aisle I walked through, I could feel them tracking my movements. At 10:47 p.m., I made the mistake of looking up. There was something in the rafters. Not a shadow, not a trick of the flickering lights, something solid. Something with too many joints and limbs that bent the wrong way. It was clinging to the beams, its long fingers twitching as it watched me. I dropped my gaze immediately. Do not look at them directly. Do not acknowledge their presence. The rules had never mentioned anything in the rafters before. I swallowed hard and kept moving. At 11:15 p.m., the back door creaked open. I froze. If the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30. I squeezed my eyes shut. Something stepped inside. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The air turned ice cold, and I heard something breathing. 4, 5, 6. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. 7, 8, 9. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and see what had come in, but I knew that was a mistake. 10, 11, 12. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. 13, 14, 15. The breath was at my ear now. 16, 17, 18. Something touched my arm. 19, 20, 21. I clenched my fists. 22, 23, 24. A whisper. A voice I didn't recognize. 25, 26, 27. My skin crawled. 28, 29, 30. I opened my eyes. The door was closed. The presence was gone, but I could still feel it. Watching. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room again. The 15 minutes stretched on for an eternity, but I knew better than to leave early. At 3:20 a.m., the vending machine turned off. That had never happened before. I checked my phone. No service. No time display. The numbers had disappeared. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Then, in the silence, the fridge door creaked open. I didn't move. Something rustled inside, shifting the cans, knocking over a bottle. I gritted my teeth. 15 minutes. No matter what. Then the whisper came again. My voice. Mark, you forgot something in aisle 12. I squeezed my eyes shut. Ignore it. At 3:30 a.m., my phone vibrated. The lights flickered back on. The vending machine hummed to life. The fridge door was closed. I walked out without looking back. At 5:55 a.m., the cameras moved again. They weren't just watching now. They were guiding me, shifting their angles as if trying to direct my gaze somewhere. I refused to follow their lead. Then the radio crackled. Static. Then Ronald's voice, urgent and low. "Mark, whatever you do, don't look at the ceiling." I felt my blood turn to ice. I wasn't sure what was worse, that Ronald was breaking protocol by using the radio, or that I had already broken the rule. Because I had looked. And now, whatever was up there, it knew. At 6 a.m., I clocked out with shaking hands. Ronald was at the door again, his face pale, his expression grim. "You looked, didn't you?" he asked. I couldn't bring myself to lie. I just nodded. Ronald exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You need to quit, Mark. Before it's too late." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But somehow, I already knew that quitting wasn't an option anymore. They wouldn't let me go. I never thought I'd end up working the night shift at Walmart. It wasn't my dream job, but after months of struggling to find work, I had little choice. The pay was decent, and the hours, though strange, allowed me to avoid the daytime rush of customers. It seemed like a quiet, almost easy gig. I was wrong. The moment I walked into the store for my first shift, something felt off. The air was thick with the sterile scent of cleaning products, and the fluorescent lights buzzed slightly, flickering just enough to make me question whether it was real or just my imagination. The store looked almost normal, but there was an unsettling emptiness that didn't sit right with me. My manager, a tall, gaunt man named Mr. Holloway, greeted me at the entrance to the employee lounge. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale like he hadn't seen daylight in years. He gave me a thin-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're the new guy, right?" "Michael?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "Yeah, that's me," I said, trying to match his energy with a polite nod. "Good. You listen well, you'll do fine here." He handed me a small, folded piece of paper. "These are the store's special rules. Read them. Follow them." I unfolded the note, scanning the list quickly. At first, they seemed normal: clock in on time, keep the aisles clean, be polite to customers. But the further I read, the stranger they became. 1. Do not go near aisle 14 after 12:37 a.m.2. If you see a customer in outdated clothing, do not approach them. Do not speak to them. If they approach you, act as though they do not exist. 3. The cameras will occasionally display static images of an empty store. If this happens, do not look away from the screen until movement returns. 4. If you hear someone whisper your name from behind you, do not turn around. No matter what. 5. If a coworker asks you to cover for them and their shift falls between 3:15 a.m. and 3:47 a.m., say no. They will insist. Do not give in. 6. At exactly 4:04 a.m., the store radio will play a song. Do not try to change the station. Do not sing along. 7. If you see Mr. Holloway anywhere other than the front office after 1:30 a.m., report to the break room immediately and lock the door. 8. Always leave before the sun rises. No exceptions. I looked up at Mr. Holloway, expecting some kind of explanation. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Is this a joke?" I asked, my voice light, though a cold pit had begun to form in my stomach. His thin smile remained, but his eyes darkened. "No, it's not." I glanced at the other employees in the lounge. No one was laughing. In fact, a few of them actively avoided my gaze. One guy, maybe in his 40s with a graying beard, caught my eye and shook his head slightly. It was a warning. Mr. Holloway clapped me on the shoulder, startling me. "You'll get used to it. Now, clock in. You start in 5 minutes." As I walked to the punch clock, the note crumpled in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I just made a mistake by taking this job. The rules felt like some elaborate prank, but the way everyone behaved, they believed in them. And soon, I would too. My first few hours on the job were uneventful, at least on the surface. I was assigned to restock shelves in the grocery section, something simple enough to keep me busy while I adjusted to the night shift. The store was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of refrigerators and the occasional beeping of the self-checkout machines. I kept thinking about the list of rules in my pocket. They made no sense. The store looked like any other Walmart at night, empty, sterile, almost boring. And yet, there was an odd sensation creeping up my spine, like the feeling of being watched. I kept brushing it off. Maybe it was just my nerves, the unfamiliarity of a new job in a near-empty store. Then, at exactly 12:37 a.m., something changed. I was in aisle 12, placing boxes of cereal on the shelves, when I felt an odd pressure in the air. It was as if the atmosphere had thickened, making it harder to breathe. The fluorescent lights flickered for a brief moment, then steadied. I froze, remembering the first rule. Do not go near aisle 14 after 12:37 a.m. Aisle 14 was only 2 aisles away. My curiosity got the best of me, and I slowly peeked around the corner. The aisle looked completely normal, rows of canned goods, some scattered promotional displays, and the same dull, sterile lighting as everywhere else. But something was wrong. A single can of soup rolled slowly across the floor, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. There was no one there. No air vents, no signs of movement. The store had been dead silent just moments before. Then, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, calling my name. I turned sharply, but there was no one behind me. My breathing grew unsteady as I backed away from aisle 14. The whisper came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from the aisle itself, from nowhere and everywhere at once. I didn't stick around to find out more. I hurried back to my cart, pushing it down the aisle faster than necessary. My hands trembled as I stocked the remaining items, my mind racing with questions. Was it a prank? Some trick played by the employees? If so, it was a damn good one. A few minutes later, I spotted another worker, an older man named Greg, the same one who had warned me with a silent shake of his head earlier. He was stocking shelves near the frozen food section. I hesitated, then approached him. "Hey, Greg, right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me, then back at his task. "Yeah. What do you need?" I heard something. Over in aisle 14. Greg stiffened slightly. He put down the box he was holding and turned to face me fully. "Did you go in?" "No," I said quickly. "I just looked. And I heard something. Like a whisper." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, kid. You want to make it through the night? Follow the damn rules. Don't question them, don't test them. Just do your job and leave before sunrise." I swallowed hard. "But what's in aisle 14? Greg's expression darkened. He hesitated before finally muttering, "Not something you want to see." Before I could ask anything else, he grabbed his cart and wheeled it away, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully, but the air of unease never left me. I kept catching movement in the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. The cameras in the security office flickered once when I walked past, and I swore I saw something on the monitor that shouldn't have been there, a shadow standing perfectly still in the middle of an empty aisle. By the time my shift ended, I practically ran to my car. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. The list of rules wasn't a joke, and I was starting to realize that whatever haunted this Walmart was very real. The next night, I arrived at work with a sinking feeling in my gut. After what had happened the night before, the whispers, the rolling can, Greg's cryptic warning, I knew something wasn't right about this place. But quitting wasn't an option. I needed the money, and besides, some part of me needed to understand what was going on. I clocked in and made my way to my assigned section, trying to ignore the way the store's fluorescent lights cast unnatural shadows along the aisles. It was too quiet again, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, thick and oppressive. As I stocked the shelves, my mind kept drifting back to the list of rules. Most of them still made no sense, but one in particular stuck out to me now. Rule 7. If you see Mr. Holloway anywhere other than the front office after 1:30 a.m., report to the break room immediately and lock the door. I hadn't seen Mr. Holloway since my first night, and I wasn't eager to find out why that rule existed. But as my shift dragged on, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the back of the store that I hadn't paid attention to before. It was plain, unmarked, and set into the far wall near the stockroom. Something about it unsettled me. I had walked past it dozens of times, yet now it stood out like a black hole in my vision. I asked Greg about it during our break. He had barely touched his food, staring down at his hands like he was deep in thought. When I mentioned the door, he stiffened. You don't go near that door, he said firmly. That's the storage room. It stays locked for a reason. What's inside? I asked. He shot me a hard look. Nothing you want to mess with. That should have been enough to keep me away, but of course, it wasn't. Sometime past 2 a.m., while making my rounds, I found myself standing in front of that door. The air felt colder here, heavier, like the store itself was warning me to turn back. But I had to know. I had to understand. I reached out and tested the handle. It turned. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing complete darkness beyond. My breath hitched. A wave of freezing air rolled out, carrying with it the scent of dust and something metallic. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But then I heard it, faint movement inside, like shuffling footsteps. I swallowed hard and stepped in. The second my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights in the main store flickered and died, leaving me in pitch blackness. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, using its weak glow to illuminate my surroundings. The storage room was bigger than I expected. Shelves lined the walls, but they weren't stocked with normal merchandise. Instead, there were boxes labeled with dates, years stretching back decades. I pulled one down at random, my fingers trembling as I pried it open. Inside were old employee name tags, all of them scratched out, the names unreadable. Something rustled behind me. I spun around, phone light darting across the room. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of my vision, a figure stepped forward from the darkness. It looked like a person, almost. But its proportions were wrong. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs stretching just a little too far. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and where its eyes should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. It took a step toward me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. My phone flickered as the battery suddenly drained, the screen going dark. And then, in the silence, I heard it whisper my name. I ran. I don't remember how I got the door open, only that I threw myself out into the store, slamming it shut behind me. The lights flickered back on. The air returned to normal. I stood there, shaking, my back pressed against the door. My hands still felt ice cold from whatever was inside. Greg found me a few minutes later. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at the door, then back at me, and sighed. I told you not to go near it, he muttered. I didn't argue. I couldn't. That night, as I left the store before sunrise, I checked my pocket out of habit. The list of rules was still there, slightly crumpled from being handled so much. One new rule had been added. Rule 9, do not open the storage room. Ever. After what happened in the storage room, I spent the rest of my shift in a daze. My mind kept replaying the sight of that twisted figure, its featureless face, the way it whispered my name from the dark. I wanted to believe I imagined it, but the new rule on the list proved otherwise. When I returned the next night, I almost expected Mr. Holloway to fire me. Maybe Greg had reported what I'd done. Maybe the store itself would decide I'd broken too many rules. But no one said a word. Greg barely looked at me, and the other employees avoided me even more than before. I told myself I'd be more careful. I'd follow the rules to the letter. No more investigating, no more curiosity. But that resolve didn't last long. Sometime past midnight, I was pushing a cart of returned items back to their shelves when I passed the security office. The door was ajar, and I caught a glimpse of the monitors inside. The screens flickered between different camera feeds, showing various parts of the store in real time. Then one of them changed. The feed switched to static for a few seconds before revealing something unsettling, an empty version of the store. No employees, no customers. Just empty aisles stretching into the distance. I frowned, stepping closer. The timestamp on the footage showed the current time, but something wasn't right. The lights were dimmer in the feed, the shelves slightly off as if they were arranged differently. And then, I saw movement. A tall, shadowy figure walked slowly down one of the aisles, moving in a jerky, unnatural way. It didn't resemble any of the employees I knew. Its arms were too long, its legs bending at strange angles. It stopped suddenly, turning its head toward the camera. Then it started walking toward it. I swallowed hard, watching as it grew closer, its movements becoming more frantic. By the time it was just a few feet away, my breath was coming in shallow gasps. And then, just as it reached the camera, the feed cut to static. I stepped back, heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't be in here. I knew I had to follow the rules. The list had been clear. 3. The cameras will occasionally display static images of an empty store. If this happens, do not look away from the screen until movement returns. But the screen was still nothing but static. What did that mean? Had I broken another rule? My hands clenched into fists as I tried to steady my breathing. Then something behind me whispered my name. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. The room was empty. The hallway outside was empty. But the whisper had been right there, just inches from my ear. I grabbed the door handle, ready to get out of there, but before I could leave, the static on the monitor cleared. My stomach dropped. The camera now showed the security office. And I wasn't alone. A figure stood directly behind me, its tall, distorted frame looming in the doorway. My breath hitched, my body frozen in terror. I could feel something cold against my back, something pressing in close. But I knew if I turned around, I wouldn't be able to leave. The screen flickered again, and in an instant, the figure was gone. I stumbled out of the security office, slamming the door shut behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my entire body drenched in sweat. Greg found me a few minutes later. He took one look at me and sighed. "You looked at the cameras, didn't you?" I couldn't even bring myself to lie. I just nodded. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. "You're lucky. Sometimes they don't leave so easily." I swallowed hard. What was that thing?" Greg didn't answer right away. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled note, the same list of rules I had. But this one had an extra rule written in shaky handwriting. "If the cameras show the security office, leave immediately. Do not turn around." By my 5th shift, I had memorized the rules. I had seen enough to know that breaking them wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. The whisper in the security office, the thing that had stood behind me, the eerie footage on the cameras, they had shaken me to my core. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. I was assigned to stock pet food that night, a simple enough task. As I wheeled my cart down the aisles, I counted each one out of habit. 12, 13, 14. My breath caught in my throat. There was another aisle. Aisle 15. That wasn't possible. The store only had 14 aisles. I had walked these rows 100 times by now. But there it was, stretching out before me, the shelves lined with unfamiliar products. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that didn't quite match up with the shelving. I should have turned around. I should have ignored it, pretended I never saw it. But my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped forward. The air was different here, thicker, harder to breathe. The shelves were filled with brands I didn't recognize, their labels written in languages I had never seen before. Some packages had no text at all, just warped images of things that barely resembled food. A soft hum filled the air, low and droning, almost like a whisper beneath my skin. My fingers tingled as I ran them along the metal shelving, and for a brief moment, my vision blurred. Then I saw the man. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, his back to me. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like a mannequin that had been posed by someone who didn't fully understand human anatomy. He wasn't moving. I took a step back. The man took a step forward. A cold rush of fear shot through me. I hadn't seen him move, but he was closer now. Much closer. I turned and bolted, pushing the cart away, not caring about the noise. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I reached aisle 14, practically stumbling over myself to get away. When I finally dared to look back, aisle 15 was gone. In its place was the blank back wall of the store, just as it had always been. Greg found me a few minutes later, still breathless, gripping the handle of my cart like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked grimly. I nodded, unable to speak. He let out a slow breath. "It shows up sometimes. That aisle. You're lucky you ran when you did." What was in there?" I managed to ask. Greg's eyes darkened. "Nothing that belongs here." I wanted to push for more, but his expression told me I wouldn't get an answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, the list of rules. My list. Except, just like before, another rule had been added in unfamiliar handwriting. If you see aisle 15, do not enter. It does not exist. By the time my next shift rolled around, I had half a mind to quit. The thought of returning to the store, to the impossible aisle, to the security cameras that watched me as much as I watched them, it made my skin crawl. But I needed the money, and more than that, I needed answers. The night started off normal. As normal as it ever got, anyway. Greg was distant, avoiding my questions about aisle 15. The other employees barely acknowledged my existence. Even the customers, those who dared to shop this late, moved through the aisles like shadows, their faces always just out of focus when I tried to look directly at them. Then, around 2:30 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, all employees. Clean up in aisle 7. I froze. The voice wasn't one I recognized. It wasn't Holloway's, nor was it one of the usual automated announcements. It was wrong. Distorted. Like someone was speaking through an old radio, their voice warping in and out of static. I turned to Greg, who was stocking shelves a few feet away. His face had gone pale. "We don't have a cleanup in aisle 7, I whispered. Greg shook his head slowly. "Don't go." But something in me couldn't let it go. Maybe it was foolishness, maybe it was some deep-seated need to understand this place, but my feet were already moving before I could stop myself. Greg didn't try to hold me back. He just muttered something under his breath and turned away. The walk to aisle 7 felt longer than usual. The store stretched on endlessly, the overhead lights buzzing louder with each step I took. When I finally reached the aisle, I saw nothing unusual at first. The shelves were fully stocked, the floor was clean. Then I noticed a puddle. Dark, viscous, and spreading slowly across the tiles. It wasn't water. It wasn't anything I could identify. The air smelled different here, metallic, like rust and something else. Something rotten. The intercom crackled again. "Clean up in aisle 7, the voice repeated. And then I heard it. A wet, shuffling sound from just beyond the next shelf. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, taking a cautious step forward. The source of the noise came into view, a figure hunched over on all fours, its body unnaturally long and thin, its limbs bending at angles that made my stomach churn. It was lapping at the dark puddle on the floor, making that sickening, slurping sound. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly raised its head. It had no face. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched too tight over an elongated skull. And yet, I could feel it watching me. The intercom crackled again. "Clean up in aisle 7, the voice said, now right behind me. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the aisle, only that I didn't stop running until I nearly crashed into Greg. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. "Did you look at it?" he asked, his voice urgent. I nodded, barely able to catch my breath. Greg swore under his breath, his grip tightening. "They know you now," he said. "They've seen you." Before I could ask what that meant, he shoved something into my hands. It was the list, the same one I'd checked a dozen times before. But there was a new rule now, written in a trembling hand. If the intercom announces a cleanup in aisle 7, do not respond. Do not look. Do not listen. After what happened in aisle 7, I started keeping my head down. I followed the rules as closely as I could, avoided looking too long at anything that seemed even slightly off, and most of all, I never responded to the intercom again. But the store wasn't done with me. I was restocking the frozen goods section when the temperature dropped. At first, I thought it was just the freezers, but this was different. The cold settled into my bones, heavier, deeper, unnatural. My breath fogged up in front of me as I placed a bag of frozen peas on the shelf. Then I saw him. A man stood at the far end of the aisle, near the sliding freezer doors. His back was to me, his body unnaturally stiff, like a statue placed in the wrong setting. He wore an old Walmart vest, faded, torn at the edges, a name tag dangling from the pocket, swinging slightly as though he had just moved. The name tag was too worn to read. I knew, instinctively, that I should leave, that I should turn around and walk the other way. But something about him held me in place. The freezer doors next to him began to frost over, ice crawling across the glass at an impossible speed. The lights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that made him seem taller than he was. And then he turned. His face was wrong. Stretched too thin, his eyes hollow and sunken, lips cracked and twisted into something that might have once been a smile. But it wasn't a smile anymore. It was something else. Something that made my stomach lurch. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I dropped the frozen peas and took a step back, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The intercom crackled. Employee number 237 returned to the freezer aisle immediately. I wasn't employee 237. At least, I didn't think I was. I'd never heard anyone use numbers before. But something in the way the voice spoke sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The man in the vest took a step forward. His shoes scraped against the tile, an unnatural, jerky movement like a puppet being pulled by unseen strings. The freezer doors behind him swung open. I didn't wait to see what was inside. I turned and ran. Greg found me in the stockroom 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor, shaking. He didn't ask me what happened. He just sighed, reached into his pocket, and handed me a folded piece of paper. It was my list. And there was a new rule. If you see the man in the freezer aisle, do not acknowledge him. Do not listen to the intercom. Do not let him take you into the freezer. By now, I had accepted that nothing about this Walmart was normal. I had seen things that defied explanation, followed rules that barely made sense, and felt eyes on me when no one was around. But despite everything, I kept coming back. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was fear that if I quit, whatever lurked in these aisles would follow me home. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed her. She was standing near the self-checkout, perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the shopping cart in front of her. Her hair was long and dark, her clothes simple, jeans and a pale blue sweater that seemed oddly out of place. At first, I thought she was just another late-night customer. But something about her made my stomach twist. She wasn't shopping. She wasn't scanning items, wasn't fumbling for her card, wasn't even looking at the screen. She was just standing there, waiting. Her cart was filled with random things: cans of soup, a single shoe, a pack of batteries, a torn plastic bag that seemed empty. None of it made sense. I glanced around. Greg was nowhere in sight, and the few other employees on shift were occupied in the back. The store was nearly empty, the silence stretching uncomfortably between the buzzing fluorescent lights. I took a hesitant step forward. "Ma'am, do you need help?" She didn't respond. Her head twitched slightly, like she had heard me but wasn't sure how to react. I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to step back. The registers are self-service," I said. "But I can ring you up if..." She moved. Not like a person, not naturally. It was as if something had nudged her forward, her feet barely lifting from the ground. She reached for the scanner, but instead of swiping an item, her fingers just hovered over the glowing screen. Her nails were too long, the tips slightly discolored. The intercom crackled. "Do not help her." I jumped, the voice sending a jolt of cold terror down my spine. It wasn't Holloway. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The speaker's voice was garbled, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. I looked around quickly, but I was alone with her. Her head turned just a little, just enough that I could see the corner of her mouth. She was smiling. The kind of smile that was too wide, too forced, like someone trying to mimic human expression and getting it horribly wrong. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. The intercom crackled again. "She is not a customer." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and hurried toward the stockroom, heart hammering. The moment I crossed into the back area, the air seemed to shift, like I had stepped into another reality entirely. The store's constant hum faded slightly, muffled, like I was underwater. Greg was there, leaning against the metal shelves, arms crossed. He raised an eyebrow at my expression. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, struggling to find my voice. "Who is she?" Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not a who. A what? She shows up sometimes. Always at checkout. Never leaves." I swallowed hard. What happens if someone helps her? Greg's face darkened. No one ever has. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket and handed it to me. Another slip of paper, another addition to the list. "If you see the woman at self-checkout, do not approach. Do not speak. She is not a customer."